Hey everyone, this is James here. I'm going to be talking today about Sergio Martino, the master, in my opinion, of the Golden Age Gialli. So really interesting director. We've talked a lot about him on the show. We've reviewed a lot of his different films, many of which I am a fan of, specifically a lot of his Gialli in that era, as well as something like Suspicious Death of a Minor, where you're going to get into arguments with Poliziotteschi fans and Gialli fans of where that film should be classified. Personally, I'm okay classifying it as both. But nonetheless, I think if you were to put together a Mount Rushmore of Gialli directors, which I've done, but I think there is kind of a general consensus here, you're going to definitely end up with Dario Argento, Mario Bava, Lucio Fulci, and I think Sergio Martino would be the fourth name on that list. So generally speaking, if you did want to exclude him, you could make it a big three, and I think most people would put Martino as the fourth of those. Nonetheless, I think if you are to kind of analyze different Italian genre film, so something like the spaghetti westerns or even the Poliziotteschi, you're going to find that most of the big films take place in kind of like one concentrated era. Gialli is a little different than that, and part of that is just the kind of inherent nature of the kind of domesticated genre there. The fact that you can make the same sort of film much later versus like needing like the desert in Almeria or whatever for the spaghetti western. The Gialli has films that are generally regarded as its masterpieces that take place outside of the era. Even something like Deep Red, 1975, that took place in an era where Gialli production was really, really ramping down, and it wasn't necessarily in vogue. You know, someone like Sergio Martino, who followed a lot of industry trends, he wasn't really making Gialli in 1975. It's only the success of Deep Red that really made him inspired him to make something like Suspicious Death of a Minor. His big Giallis, the five that he made between 1971 and 1973, those had all come by, and he directed like 5 or 6 films in between Torso and Suspicious Death of a Minor. I think if you could make a case, if there was only the Golden Age Gialli, so 1970 to 1973, I think you could easily make the case that Martino was the signature and the absolute best director of them, if you had sort of no caveats in there. When I was ranking the top 20 Gialli with no caveats whatsoever, I think I had something like 4 Martinos in the top 20, 3 in the top 11. So he really, really does dominate there. And that's in an era where I'm counting films outside of the Golden Age as well. If you just stopped it at 1973 and you said no more Gialli were created after that, I think in many ways Torso could take the sort of Deep Red mantle as sort of the big exclamation mark at the end of the genre. But there are so many good Gialli, and I like these Gialli too, that were created after that. So Deep Red, Tenebrae, New York Ripper, House with the Laughing Windows, Murder Rock, Stage Fright. All these are really, really fan favorites that are done after the Golden Age. Some barely after, something like Deep Red you could quibble with, or something that's well after it, so like Tenebrae, definitely not a ton of Gialli being made there, and it's a very unique film. And you also have stuff that took place before, so Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much and Blood and Black Lace, which is why someone like him is not necessarily included because he only did a couple different Golden Age Gialli, Bay of Blood, which is probably the most famous there. I think if you really stopped that genre in 1973, you would be like, man, this Sergio Martino guy is kind of occupying that space. I mean, if Dario Argento, if 5 Days in Milan, his comedy attempt had been more of a success, or if he had just gone on to different genres, like it's like, oh, I want to try my hand at spaghetti westerns or Poliziotteschi, maybe the trajectory would have been different. So I really think there's an alternate universe there where he's one of like the top 1 or 2 kind of signature directors of these films. So that's not to take away from what the history actually is, because I think, you know, he is a celebrated director specifically for these different Giallis, and I think it's well deserved. So one thing that's definitely true of him too, and part of it is this kind of concentrated era, is that he really did kind of have a standard group of collaborators here. I mentioned this in just about every Martino episode I did. He worked constantly with Ernesto Gastaldi, who is one of the most signature non-directorial figures when it comes into the Gialli and its development. His producer in quite a number of films, not Torso, but most of the others, is Luciano Martino, who is his brother, who happened to also be married to Edwidge Fenech, who is the star of quite a few of his most well-known Gialli. George Hilton was also married to, I believe, a cousin, so he appears in 3 of the films as well. So you have a kind of a reoccurring cast of different people, and there's a bunch of other names that cycle through, your Ivan Rasimovs, people like that are in quite a lot of the same ones. So it's kind of fun to watch the Martino cinematic universe and just see different people pop up constantly. He was probably a good guy to work with because he just seemed to work with the same people over and over. Also behind the camera, you have Giancarlo Ferrando, who lends the Martino some. And the Gialli, I think, has really benefited from Blu-rays and things like that. Seeing these films in high definition, I think, really, really signifies kind of the craftsmanship that went behind it. People like Ferrando, who were in charge of the cinematography, I think really helped to kind of establish that look. And the Martino Golden Age films all look really, really fantastic in my opinion. All 5 of them look excellent, and Suspicious Death of a Minor has some excellent work as well. Composer-wise, he worked with Nora Orlandi for Strange Vices of Mrs. Wardh, but he really worked with a guy, Bruno Nicolai, for a good number of those films, who is kind of one of Morricone's proteges, and really, really talented composer, and has done, in my opinion, some of the really signature scores of Gialli. So, really a bunch of key collaborators there. So, people are going to argue whether he's considered auteur or not, but I think whether you consider him an auteur or not, he certainly is one of the key figures of these films, and he's directed a number of very great films. I would say solid genre classics. I would say maybe all 6 of them could be considered genre classics, 5 or 6 certainly. But sort of the least auteur of them, you don't have the luridness of Fulci or kind of the visual eye, but imbalanced brain of someone like Argento, or the just ingenuity of staging of Mario Bava. There's nothing that quite pops like that, even though his soundtracks were excellent and his cinematography is excellent. And it's also nice to see that he's always doing something a little bit different here and there. So he really had that infrastructure that helped keep things moving. In my opinion, you can sort of see this, his work suffering quite a bit, and as we move into like the later 80s and the 90s, it is a testament to his skill that he could continue to work during this time when the Italian cinema and entertainment industry was not doing as well. Nonetheless, you could see that the work is not quite up to the same as his earlier stuff. So having that sort of key infrastructure and key collaborators with good resources and money to use, I think really benefited him. Even someone like Argento, who I think most people will acknowledge has a lot more resources than kind of his Italian colleagues working at the time, didn't necessarily have, you could see that his work starts to suffer too, certainly after opera and into the 90s and 2000s, even though he's still able to kind of tackle projects a little bit more slowly than someone like Martino. And Martino had to keep working. I mean, like a lot of these guys, he's a very workman-like director, so he directed a lot of sex comedies, things like that. He dabbled in just about all kinds of different genres. He did a exploitation alligator film. He did Island of the Fishmen, so it's kind of like the sci-fi fishman thing. He did a cannibal film. He did Hand of Steel, which is sort of like a Terminator Superman riff. He did some spaghetti westerns as well, both early and later in the career. So he's a guy that has directed a lot of films, and I'd say he was good at these other films, but his particular gift was really well suited towards this very specific era of kind of the Golden Age Gialli, where maybe all the stars aligned and he had the right collaborators around him at the right time. And they did just a really, really fantastic job on all 5 or 6 of those. So unlike Argento, at the time certainly, most of Martino's films could be classified as F Gialli, which is a term that I've seen Michael McKinsey use, which is kind of just like a more female-led version. Argento does have a reputation as being kind of a director of women, but at the time he hadn't really done much. The whole Animal trilogy, Deep Red, those are all male-led films, and so everything else that he did after that is taking place kind of outside of that golden age of Gialli. And even in his Gialli after that, so something like Tenebrae, it took him a bit before he started casting women in those parts. And by that time, Sergio Martino had long moved past the different Gialli. Martino in particular liked to really put his female stars through the ringer. Think about Fenech in Strange Vice of Mrs. Wardh, or even more in All the Colors of the Dark. Aeneas Strindberg in Case of a Scorpion's Tale. Or Your Vice is a Locked Room. Susie Kendall and Torso. So these females were really, really challenged and things like that. So I think roles where there's definitely a lot of sexual violence, so they're probably done in a way that's pretty different from that than you do films this day. But I think in many ways they hold up. I think he has stronger characters, and I think a lot of this could be credited towards Gastaldi, especially in probably the non-torso Gialli of his films, where you're able to focus on kind of like the psychology of Edward Fenwick. So it uses a lot of those like Freudian pop psychology and things like that going on at the time. And what I really like about him is he just does very different riffs on his material. So even though he's working with a lot of the same collaborators, including the same writer and Gastaldi, he is not necessarily doing the same thing. He is doing just kind of different flavors. Sometimes he's serving you a different dish. Strange Vices of Mrs. Wardh, for instance, takes a lot of like earlier Gialli that happened before Bird with the Crystal Plumage and combines it with kind of that Argento serial killer, black glove killer thing that was super popular at the time. So Strange Vice, you have the black glove killer, but you also have kind of this interesting psychology, this domesticated psychology between like Edwidge Fenwick and her husband. Case of a Scorpion's Tail, he's riffing on stuff like Z, Costa Graverses. It's set in Greek, or not really Greek, because Z was not technically set in Greece, even though it definitely is Greece. You have Psycho as well in that film. All the Colors of Dark, it's Rosemary's Baby, it's Polanski, Your Vice's Locked Room, it's like Poe and Black Cat, but he's doing very, very fresh spins. These are not direct remakes of that. Your Vices of Locked Room is probably my favorite of the Black Cat adaptations I've seen, just because it goes into kind of interesting and very different places than you would necessarily expect. So I think if you've seen like some Black Cat, like Argento's Black Cat or Fulci's Black Cat, which neither one is my personal favorite, those ones go in more kind of standard, predictable areas. And Torso is one of my personal favorites, where he goes super visual. I didn't even know he had this in them. It's almost purely cinematic, to use kind of a pretentious term, and very, very Hitchcockian. So if you are a Hitchcock fan, I think Torso, in particular that last act, really, really stands out. And that, in my opinion, is definitely one of the masterpieces of the Gialli, along with a couple of the others. But different people are just going to prefer different Giallis from him. So, for instance, for me, it's Strange Vices of Mrs. Wardh, Your Vices Locked Room, and Only Have the Key, and Torso. Those are like three that I'm taking to my desert island. But I could see someone else being like, what's wrong with you? How can you not take All the Colors of the Dark? That's many people's favorite, and probably in many people's top 5 Giallis of all time. So I think it really depends what you like and what kind of what you value in your Gialli. And I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer there. I think in particular all 5 of those are super great. I would also like to toss Suspicious Death of a Minor in there, which is the Poliziotteschi Gialli combination that also blends in some comedy, which I was reminded of when I recently reviewed the film as well. I think that's a very, very solid, and for me at least, Case of a Scorpion's Tail and Suspicious Death of a Minor. Those are the ones that I would toss on if I want something breezy, fun, and a bit of a romp. So yeah, let's see what else I got here. He's really gifted at crafting different set pieces. He would also become, I think that's one of his strengths in terms of set piece creation for the Poliziotteschi and doing kind of violent car chases and things like that. So something like the Violent Professionals. You see this skill in Suspicious Death of a Minor, but in just how he stages different deaths. He's not quite Argento level in terms of like just the creativity and the nastiness in which he will kill someone with a knife. But he is nonetheless very good visually and just crafting these different things. He also, I feel like, is a little bit more rooted in kind of the predecessor to Gialli compared to some of his peers of Gothic horror. Of course, someone like Bava was very, very versed in that as well, because that's where he got his start. But I think you can see elements of that in Strange Vices of Mrs. Wardh, All the Colors of the Dark, and in particular, Your Vices of the Locked Room, and Only I Have the Key. We're going to these kind of like old European Gothic style castles and things like that. And I think that's really fun and really interesting. For me personally, I'm not a huge Gothic horror fan. I find them to be a little languid and a little lacking energy at times. But I do really like the atmosphere. So for him to kind of take those different elements and bring it kind of into a more updated 1970s look in his Gialli, I think is really interesting, and I think does very well, holds up very well. So yeah, in the end, I think his contributions are starting to be celebrated, and I think they could be celebrated even more. I think the Golden Age is defined as very much as by him as well as Argento. I think he's done 5 of the very best Golden Age Gialli out there. I would take his Golden Age output above Argento's, above the Animal trilogy, as much as I love them. I think his films really do hold up. So in watching different Martino films, I did try to check out some of his deeper cuts, and I didn't end up doing an episode on that just because I didn't find the film quality to be quite as good. So it is a little bit of a shame that the film quality does drop at a certain point. But nonetheless, I think he still has a number of films that are worth checking out. I'd in particular recommend Hand of Steel, which is kind of his Terminator Superman one. Just a fun film. This one is very, very 80s. I think that one's probably soundtracked by DeAngelis Brothers. Mountain of Cannibal God is also quite fun too, as far as like the cannibal films go. I think it's a pretty decent one. And his spaghetti westerns are generally okay. Manaha with Maurizio Merli, of all people, and Arizona Cult Returns are both, solid efforts. He dabbled in kind of post-apocalyptic and things like that. I wasn't a huge fan of After the Fall of New York 2019, but that's not really the genre that I'm into either. So, I think a lot of people, depending on what you're interested in, like if you really like those post-apocalyptic, I would definitely recommend that film. It's just not personally what I go for. Okay, so let me know how you like this episode. Let me know if there are some deep Martino cuts that I missed and I should definitely check out. I've probably seen 25 of his films at this point, so it feels like I'm starting to run a little dry there. But I think, just wanted to make a video tribute to, I think, one of the great masters of the Golden Age Gialli, perhaps the master of the Golden Age Gialli. So thank you all for tuning in. I'll see you all next time. Cheers.